Hello and welcome back to Truth is Lacking. I'm sitting down with a friend of mine, Dr. Marcus Ross. I had the privilege of being in a class with him years ago, and it was extremely challenging. It was excellent. It was excellent. And Dr. Ross has a reputation around campus of difficult classes, but this is a good thing. This is a good thing.
And you were only in the class once.
I was only in class
as opposed
once.
to some.
That's true. As opposed to some. I appreciate it because there's this idea with science and faith that they're not compatible, and something that I greatly appreciated that you did as a scientist, as a believer, is equipping us to understand the arguments in science, understand the difficulties that exist both scripturally and scientifically, and how to help resolve some of these matters. So I appreciate it's not just his class was not just the typical pendulum on one side or the other. Is really working these things out using the mind God has given us, and as well as research that has been done. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Ross. He is a paleontologist. And paleontology, for those of you that don't know, is basically an expert in dinosaurs. Paleontology interacts with all different fields of science. So they have to be pretty well versed in a lot of different fields, a lot of different topics. And Dr. Ross is, if you don't mind, sharing a little bit about how you became a paleontologist and some of the difficulties you faced in doing that. As we discuss some of these things, Dr. Ross is a believer. He believes in a young earth, and he is a creationist. So we'll help define some of those concepts, but we want to have that disclosure up front, but as well as to recognize science does not have to be afraid of faith, and faith does not have to be afraid of science. The two fields are actually quite compatible, and God has a lot to say about a lot of it. So if you don't mind, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, your what you have done, your history, and how you became a paleontologist and building into that field?
Yeah, so paleontology is the discipline of studying fossils and ancient life. And I became interested in dinosaurs when I was just 4.5 years old for the very first time, discovered what they were, and it just sent me off on a trajectory of wanting to know everything that I could about these amazing animals. That led me to go to, my home state was Rhode Island. I ended up going to Pennsylvania State University, go Nittany Lions, in order to pursue an undergraduate degree in geology. My dad had told me, listen, paleo is, I know that's what you want to do, but make sure you're well-rounded. It's good advice. Don't go for something that's so tremendously narrow that if you come out at the other end and you didn't like it or there's not much for jobs, you got little to show for it. So I did an undergraduate in geology or earth science at Penn State University. The love and passion for paleontology continued all the way through that. I took every paleo course that I could, did work on that for my senior research project. Then I went out to South Dakota, to the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, which is a small engineering and mining school out in the Black Hills of South Dakota in Rapid City. And absolutely loved the Black Hills area. Had a tremendously difficult time at the school because of my creationist perspective. Not something that I ever brought into the classroom, but just the simple fact that I was a creationist and was willing to speak about it in external situations ended up causing some trouble. Nonetheless, after I was in South Dakota, I ended up boomeranging back to my home state of Rhode Island, where I worked on my PhD in paleontology, again, studying a group of animals called mosasaurs. These are big swimming marine reptiles, and if you've seen Jurassic World, the mosasaur is that big marine reptile, that giant lizard, and they actually were true lizards.
Wow.
As opposed to dinosaurs, which though their name means terrible lizard, dinosaurs aren't lizards anatomically and biologically. So once I got through all that training, K through PhD, all in state schools, I was never in a private Christian school or anything like that. I came to Liberty University and taught at Liberty University for 16 years. And some of the class that you got to take was Creation Studies 290,
Yes.
A general survey course in creation evolution issues. And I also taught an advanced creation course there. I taught earth sciences, geology, paleontology, some environmental classes, whatever they asked. And that could be justified based on my background. You mentioned paleontology is kind of, it's got this broad field to it, and it's true in order to learn about the fossils in the rocks, you have to learn a lot of biology because you're dealing with organisms, whether it's plants or dinosaurs or whether it's trilobites or algae, whatever it happens to be. You've got to learn a good deal of biology. Of course, evolutionary theory plays into that as well. And you also have to learn a lot of geology because the fossils are found in a geologic context. So my trajectory through paleontology was more frequently in the geological side of things, and what the presence of certain types of organisms in the rocks can tell us about those rocks, how they formed, or what was going on as we trace the organisms vertically up through the different layers of rocks. So my own particular interests ended up being in what's called biostratigraphy. So bio, life, strata, the layers. So tracing the different life forms as you go up and down through the rock layers themselves. And there's a lot of different fields in paleontology. You can focus on the evolution aspect, or you can focus on things, really neat things like what's called taphonomy, which is everything that happens to an organism from the time it dies to the time it's recovered as a fossil. So, looking at the fossil to try and discover, was it a body that was left out for some period of time? Was it scavenged by other organisms? Was it processed together in an area that saw tumultuous, big, heavy currents accumulate this? Or was this something that was a quieter setting? All these sorts of things. What happened? Was it compressed? And if so, how bad? So there's all sorts of interesting things that one can look at from the fossil. Even when the fossil is distorted or broken in various ways, that actually tells you about its post-life history.
That's truly amazing. You can tell for someone like me by just looking at the dirt that it's in what took place and what happened. That's it. There's clearly overlap in the sciences with that, to be able to compile that information and to extract truth from that. Like what's happening here, what took place.
Absolutely. Additional stuff from chemistry, and now as people have discovered that there's original soft tissue that sometimes is found within fossils.
Which is amazing, by the way.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get to that. But that brings in a whole aspect of biochemistry and living organismal biology in comparison to soft tissue that paleontology never really dealt with in the past, because we always figured that the only thing that we have left are the hard parts or the tracks or burrows and things like that. And the idea of, well, is this actually giving us something like a blood vessel, a real blood vessel? It was a complete shock when that first started happening in 2005.
That's amazing. I didn't realize it was 2005 that started happening.
Yeah.
I definitely became aware of that a lot later than 2005. But that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I would hope to get to that at some point, because that truly is fascinating. That challenges a lot of traditional thought on fossils, to have this original soft tissue found present in the bones. So I want to ask you then, in relation to this, these overlaps of these different sciences, you have spent an extreme amount of time in study, a lot of time you spend now also in further research. One of the things to recognize that I love about science is a scientist doesn't just like achieve it and now they've made it, and then they just stop. A true scientist will continue learning, continue challenging these concepts that we have, because science is supposed to lead us to greater truth, right? And for the Christian, this is important to know. A Christian has no need ever to be afraid of truth, right? If something is true, it can handle the investigation, which is what science is supposed to do: investigate what we think is here and see where the evidence leads us. Likewise, Christian, we have no need to be worried about interacting with these things, because if something is truly true, Christians believe all truth comes from God. So if something is true, we have nothing to worry about, because truth can handle the investigation. Likewise, it can handle the interrogation as well. If we think we have found truth, we should be able to not only investigate it, but interrogate it. Basically meaning try to disprove it. Is there something we can do to show that whatever the thought is not accurate? Because if something is true, truth will come out on the other side unafraid of going through these challenges. And that's something that I appreciate about true Christianity, the biblical Christianity. God says, come, let us reason together. All sorts of aspects of where God is. Further in the book of Isaiah, come, bring your case, bring your arguments, let's talk about this. I mean, God is not afraid to interact with these things. So whether it's a spiritual thing that we're dealing with, God says bring it. Whether it's a physical thing in sciences, God has God has gifted humanity to search these things out, as well as these things testify to the grand nature of who God is. So, Christian, we have no need to be worried about the interplay with faith and science. So that's something that I want to actually ask about, because especially in the book of Genesis, the early chapters make some pretty, what would seem like outlandish claims. All humanity comes from a single set of parents, Adam and Eve. By this act of disobedience, suddenly all creation is subjected to futility because of this sinful act. And a few chapters later, we see this giant ship show up and animals are going on there. And let alone animals, like this idea that things have not evolved from simple life to more complex, but God is making these claims that He made all these species according to their kind, and they procreate from there. And there's a lot of really seemingly outrageous claims that Christianity's been scrutinized for a long time over, and sometimes, by the way it's presented, rightly so, being scrutinized. But at the same time, as a trained scientist, with all of this interplay of all these different fields of science that you've had to go through, is it reasonable to believe these things the way Genesis says that it is?
I think that it is. It's not always easy, but I think that it is reasonable. So one of the things that I would say in class, for example, when you were there, is that I take the Bible as part of the evidence base for establishing my understanding of the truth of the world around me. I think that the Bible makes very reasonable and factual truth claims throughout, and my confidence in the ones, let's say Jesus' resurrection, for example, help me to anchor my questions that I might have when the evidence is not quite as strong. So the evidence for creation is not as strong, I would say, as the evidence for the resurrection, in part because the evidence for the resurrection happened much more recently. There was much more documentation, all that sort of stuff.
That's a good point.
So I think that one of the things that we use as a principle in biblical interpretation is we let the clear help us understand the unclear, right? So you can always find a passage that's really weird, and you could end up going off on these bizarre perspectives.
Absolutely.
But we don't want to let those unclear passages drive out the interpretations of passages that are actually very clear, that are speaking to the same issue. In a similar sort of way, I look at the factual documentation of Christian history and say, all right, we've got very good reason to hold to the position that we're at. And when we come to the places that are trickier, that gives me confidence that my step out into faith is not a step out into the dark. It's not a blind leap, but rather it's simply another step on a path that has been well trod and well established, even though perhaps there's a little bit of fog, over the path at this point. So particular areas of science, I spend a lot of time thinking about geology and fossils and things like that, increasingly more dealing with some topics on the origin of mankind. When it comes to issues like geology, I'd mentioned the soft tissue.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. So most geologists will point to things like radioactive dating as an example of what proves an ancient age of the Earth. That is a good argument. That's a really, really good argument for the ancient age of the Earth, because it's based on very well established physics. And if you want to say that the Earth is much younger than this, you're going to have to account for all the radioactive materials that seem to have decayed into certain radioactive decay products within a short period of time. And so for most creationists, that means you're looking at some sort of accelerated rate of radioactive decay, which means you're playing with some of the way that physics operates, and not just for radioactive decay. That has implications elsewhere.
That's important to realize, yeah.
Yeah, so a creationist ought not be just cavalier and say, well, the rate of radioactive decay was a lot faster then. I think that's the case, but we also have to recognize that there are reverberations to that claim that affect other things. But if the Earth is young, and I think even from radioactive decay we've got some good examples of why that might be true, but if the Earth is young, then there are going to be certain things that we expect to find in the rock record, in the fossil record, that one would not expect to find if the Earth was actually very ancient. And it's not always young Earth creationists that are finding these things, right? There's not very many of us out there, and we don't have a whole lot of funding. So for those of you out there, help out a little bit. I'd direct you actually over to coresci.org, Core Academy of Science, run by a good friend of mine, Todd Wood. He's an outstanding biologist, and his organization funds student research grants.
Oh, wow.
To help young scholars get mentored by other creationists in geology, in theology, biology, philosophy. It's pretty wide ranging. And that's a great way to help out an organization that's small, that's punching above their weight, if you will.
Wow,
They're doing a lot of really good work and have the vision to help train up that next generation.
We'll put a link of that in the description of this video.
Yeah,
so folks want to do that.
The Sanders Scholars
That'd be great.
Are what they're called.
Okay.
And thinking about these things that get found, so the discovery of soft dinosaur tissue was first reported in 2005 by Mary Schweitzer. She's a paleontologist in North Carolina, not a creationist. In fact, she used to be a young Earth creationist until she went into paleontology and abandoned that particular view. Nonetheless, she was working on a big T-Rex leg bone, a femur. It would have been about that big or so. And it turned out that when a graduate student made a mistake in her lab and dissolved material in an acid too long, they were left with some weird gooey material. And he brought it to her. He's like, "I'm really sorry, I messed up the experiment on it."
Whoops! Please don't get me in trouble.
But when they looked at it, she said to him, "Do that again," because there were these filaments that were kind of stretchy, and it looked like possibly blood vessels or other sort of original organic material.
Wow!
They did it again. They got the same exact results, and then she called up her the person who was leading that particular excavation, her former PhD advisor, Jack Horner. He's the paleontologist that the original Dr. Grant in Jurassic World was based off of.
Oh, wow.
Jack Horner is a legend in paleontology, just fantastic scientist who's done decades and decades of good work. So they worked this over again, kept getting the same thing, and these materials looked like blood vessels, and you could take tweezers. There was a video that they did of this. You could take the tweezers, pull them, and they would snap back into position.
Oh my goodness.
Still stretchy. And it looked like there were little blood cells inside them.
Oh my goodness.
Couldn't prove it exactly, but it sure looked like they were these iron-rich balls. And our blood vessels as mammals, not blood vessels, our blood cells as mammals, our red blood cells, have this weird, disc shape to it with an indentation all the way around. That's because our blood cells have no nucleus, our red blood cells. Our white blood cells have nuclei. They're bigger, sorts of things. But the red blood cells for mammals don't. But in birds and reptiles, amphibians and fish, they do. And so their blood cells are actually circular.
Okay.
And they're iron-rich. And they found iron-rich circular structures inside these blood vessels.
Wow.
So this was met with tremendous skepticism in the evolutionary community.
I would imagine.
Because these biomolecules that make up the things that are in the blood vessels just don't last that long. Even under ideal conditions, when you put them, into like a minus 80 degrees freezer, we know that they will degrade over time. And there's no place on Earth where you get minus 80 aside from Antarctica.
Okay.
So, the fact that these are being excavated in Montana, where it's warm in the summers and it's cold in the winters, but never that cold, and the crust is actually much more evenly temperatured throughout the year. So in Montana, the average rock temperature at the surface is going to be about 58 degrees.
No, we're close to the negative 80.
It's not even a regular freezer. It's not even your refrigerator.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's relatively warm. So these things decay very, very fast under normal conditions. So Schweitzer found it in 2005. They continued work on that. They found another fossil from a different animal, a duck-billed dinosaur, in a lower rock unit, so not even the same rock unit. Found blood materials and even intact cells inside the bone, what we call osteocytes. They are the cells that build the bone around themselves. And under a scanning electron microscope, you could see exactly these things. They compared well against modern osteocytes that they were looking at from birds. And you went, my goodness, this appears real. And the discoveries started rolling in after that. And so now, 15, 17 years later from the initial discovery, we've got dozens and dozens of papers that are recording original soft tissue from a variety of different organisms. And all of this is the sort of thing that doesn't seem to work well in an old Earth viewpoint, but is well within the horizon of degradation if the world is young. So if the Earth is old, these things degrade and we'll never see them.
We should never see them.
Not tens or 100+ million years ago. If the world is only a few thousands of years old, it's conceivable that we would discover them, but still difficult, still very unlikely, just because the process of fossilization should probably destroy these things. And I mean, going through paleontology, we were all taught fossilization obliterates all the original organic material. That's just kind of, we all knew this.
Wow.
Turns out we didn't, So even as a young Earth creationist, I didn't think this way because I was never taught, that there was any other option out there. So, since then, there's actually been some other young Earth creationists who have done similar research, discovering original soft connective tissue in the horn core of a triceratops and things like that. So really, really neat stuff is going on. All of this is much easier to reconcile in a young Earth perspective of geologic history than it is to do in an old Earth. Now, in Jurassic World, they say, oh, no problem, iron binds to it, and that's more of the fiction side of science fiction than the original. Part of that comes from Mary Schweitzer's continued work. She is searching for a chemistry that can bind and keep these things stable for tens of millions of years. And she's done some interesting proof of concept studies on this. I'll grant her that she is a good scientist. But what you have to do in the laboratory to get some of this stuff to hang around and not degrade are procedures that could never be replicated in the natural world. You don't get a centrifuge, you don't get to purify things, you don't get to isolate possible contaminants. This is inside a bone, it's a stew, and you can't just sequester the stuff that might be problematic. Instead, it seems like there was a sealed casing of fossilization that preserved this stuff on the inside. And for a young Earth creationist, that's tremendously exciting. I think actually for everybody it's exciting, but for a young Earth creationist on the time issue, it's very, very exciting.
I think that's a very good point. One, I want to comment that's something I've always have respected about you, that you're so gracious to those that would oppose your stance. You're always very kind and gracious to them. I mean, if I was to be in that field and soft tissue showed up and bones that was supposed to be 65 million years old, be gotcha. See, I said we were right.
Right.
But you've never responded that way, and I think that's one of the things that as Christians we should take away from is recognize for somebody to believe in God. Right, the Scripture says it requires the conviction of the Holy Spirit for a heart to change. So there's never a reason to say gotcha on something. But we want to, as Peter says, 1 Peter 3:15, that we should have a reason, be able to give a reason why we have the hope that we have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. And this is something about truth. So here is a relatively taught for a long time, dinosaurs are millions of years old. As you said in paleontology, when a bone goes through the fossilization, it obliterates all organic material. So there was no reason to ever look for this or to investigate for this. It was discovered by accident, and yet it's been duplicated dozens and dozens of times. So this is something that we can see that though there at times are difficulties in looking at this early biblical text, what does it say, and trying to bring these things together with current science and what the Scripture says, there are certainly difficulties at times. But this is where the Christian has to make the decision. What is authoritative in truth? And as Dr. Ross was pointing out, he starts with something more recent, the resurrection. There is ample evidence to demonstrate the reliability and the validity of the resurrection of Jesus. Fantastic work has been done on that. And because the resurrection is such a pivotal point for Christianity, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ isn't crucified, we are to be pitied before all people, and our faith is totally in vain and it's void. So if the resurrection is indeed true, and everything hangs upon this, then that would mean it would give validity to even the difficult passages that are hard to reconcile with current science. And here is an aspect where these beginning chapters can be difficult at times to trying to piece these things together, but as you've demonstrated, just one bit of evidence that has now been on accident came to the platform of the world stage. The soft tissue that is within these bones wasn't just a fluke thing, but has happened dozens of times and being found. Is giving more and more, if you will, evidence to the validity of these early claims that the Bible makes. So, Christian, we don't have to be worried about if I can't prove or disprove if these things are true. We know that God will manifest His glory and His truth as we continue to research, continue to investigate. Truth will always come out and show itself. Just like Paul writes to Romans 1, that God has made His invisible attributes clearly perceivable, clearly seen by what He has made. And here is something where even these difficult things for the educated mind who's trained in science can have difficult trying to grasp these early claims that Genesis makes, but yet here we have some incredible evidence. So I want to ask you, in relation to this, is Jurassic Park possible with all this soft tissue stuff coming up? Can we duplicate these dinosaurs and have a place to go see them?
I wish. I really do. Sort of. Right? It seems that the raptors are constantly problematic.
They're constantly a problem.
But no, even though DNA from dinosaurs has actually been recovered, Schweitzer's team actually did recover DNA in very small fragments. It's kind of like thinking of taking the encyclopedia, which would have about the same volumes of the encyclopedia, which would have about the same amount of information as the little bits of information in our DNA. If we think about how many A's, G's, T's, and C's that we have, those nucleotides, we have several billion in our in each one of our cells. That would be like a set of encyclopedias. Send that through the chipper shredder, right? Send that through a wood shredder, and or even the paper shredder. Really, page at a time. Send it through the chipper, the page shredder, and then see if you could reconstruct the encyclopedia. It's not going to happen. You've got fragments of words, individual letters, things like that, because DNA is a very, very unstable molecule. Your body is spending energy and effort all the time maintaining its stability in your cells. And as soon as you die and those processes are no longer around, DNA starts to break apart because it's designed to be able to break apart. Inside the chromosomes in your cells, in the nucleus of your cells, the DNA is wound up in the famous double helix. It's like taking a ladder and twisting it around, and we have biological molecules that are like a little zipper. They'll open up a section and that will split it apart. It doesn't take much energy actually to do that. It's pretty easy to unzip it, and then you have another molecule that once you've read what you need, zips it back up behind it. So, all of us who fought with our zippers at time when both of them are there and you got this big hole in the middle.
So true.
That's basically what's happening with the DNA. You've got a hole that opens up and another one that's closing it behind, and you're reading out little bits.
Oh, wow.
And the ability to do that easily is the reason why DNA breaks apart so quickly and starts to make weird little chemical bonds with other things nearby and just degrades. There are other sorts of things like what Schweitzer and these other papers now coming out are mostly finding are a bit more durable proteins, things like collagen, which is a connective tissue. It's the reason why the skin on your hand, for example, you can move it around and then it goes back, right? It's like you got a bunch of little rubber bands here, and they stretch, but then they come back, and they stretch and they come back. And collagen is what really kind of holds a lot of our body together in place. It's tough. It's a real tough molecule. But even that, being one of the most durable molecules that we have in our body, does not have a timeline of preservation that goes back multiple millions of years, never mind tens or hundreds of millions of years, even under the best of all types of circumstances. It's for those reasons that Jurassic Park isn't going to happen. The best chance that you have, and Jack Horner, Schweitzer's advisor way back when, he's actually been involved in several projects that are trying to see if there's a way that you could reverse engineer the DNA of things like chickens in order to express what they believe are genes that were turned off through evolutionary time, because in their view, birds evolved from dinosaurs, and when they look at the genes, for example, there are genes to build teeth in chickens.
Interesting.
And if you play around and turn off the genes that repress those, you'll get these little weird tooth bud sorts of things in the jawbone of the chicken. Not in the beak. The beak is actually made up of a different protein that kind of coats over it. But you get these weird little tooth buds.
Interesting.
So for my evolutionary colleagues, they look at that and like, well, that's evidence that, birds came from dinosaurs. And I guess my retort on that would be, no, that would be an indication that some birds have the genes to make teeth. And we have plenty of birds in the fossil record that are absolutely birds that have teeth. So being toothless is a feature of modern birds, but it is not a feature of all birds. But nonetheless, so we can think about, what's the loss of genetic information, which is something that creationists talk about quite a bit.
Yes.
Birds, did the ground fowl, the grouse, chicken, turkey group, were there members that actually had teeth in the past? And does that tell us anything about maybe even what environmental cues might help the bird's genetics in effect choose between whether you express teeth or whether you express beaks? Or once you start expressing beaks, does that lock you in a particular direction? And we've lost the ability to turn on these other sorts of things. So it's really interesting stuff going on there.
No kidding.
Yeah.
It gets complex very quickly.
It does.
That's for sure.
And that's the fun part. So in thinking about these things like soft tissue, and there's other things in radioactive dating that will make it look like maybe the world's not so old, that it's actually younger. These are not defeater arguments for an ancient age of the Earth or evolution. They're challenges to those, and they're points of consistency with a young Earth creation perspective. But one of the things that I think we have to remember is that there's no magic bullet on either side that wipes out all other arguments. That's the sort of thing that sometimes we get ourselves into and think, oh, I've got a proof text in the Bible, and that means that this biblical, this argument for theology, I can completely diffuse and defeat because I've got this one verse. Do you, right? Or do you have that verse, in proper context? And likewise with science, when we find something, it may upend everything that we know. It could have the potential to do that if it's substantial enough. This discovery is really big.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you've got other arguments that this doesn't affect. So this is a different argument from radioactive dating, and which is why Schweitzer and the other paleontologists out there are looking for a way to try to see if they can get these biomolecules to preserve for long periods of time.
They can find a mechanism of some sort to preserve them.
Because they already think that the prior commitment to radioactive dating and other sorts of evidences commits them to an ancient Earth. And from their perspective, this is an anomaly in the data. Whereas I look at it and say, actually, this might be an anomaly that's starting to point us towards the right answer, actually.
Right answer, yeah.
That it's not an anomaly, it's actually a bit of evidence that's pointing us elsewhere. And that means, that's why I think as we talk about these sorts of things, even with our friends or certainly online, if you like, hopping in on the chat boxes and throwing your gloves on, to have a humility of recognizing that we don't have all the answers to these things, that these are challenges, these are difficulties, but they're not the one, they're not the one fact to rule them all, if you will, right? This isn't the thing that then fixes everything, and you can't just go and say, you guys lose because I have this fact. Instead, we have to be more patient with it. We have to be more cautious and careful. And the better that we are at that, the better our interactions with those who differ with us on these topics is going to be. If you can bring forth an evidence for your position with grace and humility, as Peter instructs us to do so, the old phrase, you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar, right? We have a tendency to want to prove ourselves right, to show ourselves to be correct, to show our opposition that they're just wrong, wrong, wrong. And I've been guilty of doing that in the past, but over time, I've tried to become more comfortable with disagreements, become more comfortable with ambiguities at times, because the data don't all point in the same direction, and sometimes our reading of the text doesn't always point in the same direction. Yeah. So recognizing that other people out there are really smart, that they've investigated. I mean, none of this stuff that we've talked about is something that I personally have investigated. So I have to make sure that I give proper credit and respect to those who have done work that, beyond my pay grade. I didn't figure this out, and appreciate the work that they do. I love science, and I love the work that scientists do. I look for, I go onto like Real Clear Science to catch up, what are the big headlines of the day, and if something's really good, okay, I'll go see if I can read the journal article, not with the expectation of, oh, what are those evolutionists, found now? What's the new lie? No. I might disagree with their interpretation, but I want to find out what's the new thing that God has now revealed through his world that was never known before. And I think what you said before, the truth that God has given to us is something that's for all of us, and it will resonate and be consistent, if not now, ultimately, as we put the pieces together. So that gives me an excitement to discover things that even 10 years ago I might not have had, as I was in a little bit more of that kind of hardened warfare sort of mentality. And now it's like, somebody found a dinosaur with feathers? Oh, fantastic. What does it look like? Somebody found a human skull bone in a deep, dark cave, and they had to use fire to get down there. Oh, really? Tell me more. Because, is this a human? And if so, what do they look like? Do they look like you and me, or do they look different? Or, but if they're using fire to get down to the back end of a cave to deposit the bodies of their relatives, something interesting happened in the past. Was that during the flood, after the flood? Those sorts of questions are the ones we get to ask after that about creation.
That's an excellent point. Christians in particular, all people, but Christians in particular, don't need to be afraid of whatever the newest revelations are coming out. A lot of times, as has been pointed out, that sometimes the presupposition that you start off with is what you'll try to cling and hold on to. For the Christian, they'll say, well, the Bible is true, young creationists, and so forth. Those on the other side, they might try to explain these things using different sets of metrics and to try to make sure that their camp stays true. We don't have to be worried about that, Christian. As we investigate these things, truth will always be able to come out on the other end. And as you said, humility is what's required of here. And if the passage came to mind as you said that Proverbs says, 6 things the Lord hates, 7 is an abomination to him, and one of those things is pride. Yeah. And so we have to come to the table with humility and looking at these things. There are brilliant people. There are intelligent people, highly intelligent people that might not have the same conclusions I do, but that doesn't make them stupid in their field.
Right.
And so how do we take what they're doing and work all this together and have true dialogue, true conversation? We're interacting with another human being, and that's really the biggest thing. Christian, we're interacting, even if somebody doesn't agree with us, we're interacting with another human being that if we truly believe in the biblical worldview, they were equally made in the image of God. So therefore, they demand that dignity, that respect, that value. And that's how we should interact with them. And I, too, used to be on the fighting side. Like, okay, I'm going to just wait for you to get stumbled in your words and hit you with them.
Yeah.
And that's not the way to win anybody. And ultimately, the goal that we have is not to defeat somebody with a scientific argument. The ultimate goal is to be available for the Holy Spirit to speak through us, to minister to that person that God loves more than we could ever imagine. Thank you so much for this. There's a particular book that I know that you were a part of, and I want to definitely highlight that. Oh. And are there any other books that you would recommend for folks to read? I see one of them here. I want to grab them. I know this is one, so if you would,
sure,
talk about this one.
This is the one that I was using to edit out our little errors along the way, or things like that. I was privileged to work on this textbook called The Heavens and the Earth, Excursions in Earth and Space Science. This was a textbook that we used to teach at Liberty University. Cedarville University uses it, Patrick Henry College, Masters University, a number of creation-affirming Christian colleges and schools use this as their textbook for earth science and geology. My co-authors are Dr. John Whitmore from Cedarville, also from Cedarville, Dr. Steve Gallmer, and from Answers in Genesis, astronomer Dr. Danny Faulkner. And so 2 geologists, atmospheric physics guy to do our meteorology, and an astronomer. And it was a delightful project. I'll actually be working this summer on revisiting, updating. It's been a few years now. Fantastic. And so we got to get our 3rd edition up and running for this. So I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be fun. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in the world of energy, and we have a chapter on energy resources.
Wonderful.
So I gotta do a lot of update on that. Some other things I would just resources and things that I might recommend. I don't have a whole lot of books and articles. I've got a number of articles that I've written. You can find a couple of articles that I've written about how to approach creation from a very positive standpoint at the website of what's called Sapientia. And two essays in particular, one that I called Finite Games, Infinite Games and Creation, looking at how do we have a proactive and positive view of creation research and who's been doing that and what does it look like. Another one in which I was interacting with a recent proposal that Adam wasn't the only person that was created and from whom we descend, but so a very different perspective than what most of us think about when we hear about Adam in the Bible. So it's kind of a response to a recent book by Dr. Josh Swamidass, in which I defend a historical Adam position, traditional historical Adam position, also on Sapientia. So it's a neat place because they always have these, wide-ranging discussions and debates amongst a variety of perspectives. You can see me and a bunch of my colleagues in creation in the movie. If you haven't seen it, Is Genesis History? That's available right now free on YouTube. It was released in 2017 in theaters. It was the 5th highest grossing documentary of the year, which was really pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And it was a great film to be involved in. So the whole film, once COVID hit and everybody shut down really hard at the beginning, the director was like, you know what? People can just watch this. And so he stopped selling the DVD and just put it on YouTube.
Wow.
And there's a variety of extra DVDs that are there that have a couple of things from me and lots of other great folks that were involved in that. So those would be some great places to check out and start.
Yeah.
Of course, at Cornerstone Educational Supply, the company that my wife and I started, we produce science supplies for homeschoolers, private schools, colleges, and universities. So one of the ways that you can support good creationist research is if your school or your home co-op or whatever needs materials, take a look at our website and see if there's things that we can help you with, because part of what we want to do is take the proceeds that we make from profits and funnel that towards creation research. So our goal with the company is, yes, to get you the things that you need and to pay our own bills, but really to help those things like the Sanders Scholars through Core Academy of Sciences. We want to give back to the creation community in a way that helps to build out new scholars over time.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Shane,
Dr.
thank
Ross.
you very much. Appreciate being on with
appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Watch for more of these to come. God bless you.